The oxygen masks dangled like broken promises above Maya Chen's head, swaying with each violent shudder of Flight 447. She pressed her palm against the small oval window in row 23, seat C, watching the Pacific Ocean stretch endlessly below. Too close, far too close for comfort. The captain's voice had cracked just moments before, a hairline fracture in his professional composure that sent ice water through her veins. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing some technical difficulties with our hydraulic systems." Maya had flown this route between Los Angeles and Tokyo dozens of times in her role as a cultural liaison for international adoptions, but she'd never heard uncertainty bleed through a pilot's words like spilled coffee staining white fabric. The elderly Japanese man beside her in 23B clutched a worn leather prayer book, his weathered fingers moving across pages yellowed with decades of devotion. Behind her, she could hear the soft whimpering of a child, probably the little girl with the stuffed elephant she'd noticed during boarding. The plane lurched again and Maya's laptop bag slid across the floor, spilling its contents. Among the scattered papers was a photograph that made her breath catch. A 5-year-old boy with eyes like dark stars, standing in the courtyard of the Sunshine Orphanage in Kyoto. Kenji. She was supposed to meet his adoptive parents tomorrow morning at Narita Airport. They'd been waiting 3 years for this moment, jumping through bureaucratic hoops and emotional obstacles that would have broken lesser souls. "Ma'am, are you all right?" The flight attendant, a woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun, had materialized beside their row. Her name tag read Patricia, and despite the controlled chaos erupting around them, her voice carried the steady warmth of someone who had weathered countless storms. "I'm fine," Maya managed, though her hands trembled as she guarded the scattered papers. "Just worried about—" Another violent shake cut her off. The lights flickered, and somewhere in the cabin someone screamed. Patricia placed a steady hand on Maya's shoulder, her touch grounding and real in a world that suddenly felt like it was dissolving at the edges. "We're going to be okay," Patricia said, but Maya caught the micro-expression that flashed across her face, a tightening around the eyes that spoke of training scenarios and emergency protocols she hoped never to use. Maya had built her career on reading people, on understanding the unspoken languages that exist in the spaces between words. As a cultural liaison, she'd helped bridge the gaps between heartbroken birth mothers and hopeful adoptive families, between children who'd lost everything and adults desperate to give them a new beginning. She'd learned to see past surface smiles to the grief beneath, to recognize the difference between genuine hope and wishful thinking. And right now, every instinct she'd honed over 8 years in this work was screaming that they were in serious trouble. The captain's voice returned, steadier this time, but with an undercurrent that made Maya's chest tight. "Flight attendants, please prepare for emergency procedures." The words hit the cabin like a physical force. The man beside her began praying in rapid Japanese, his voice barely audible above the increasingly vocal distress of their fellow passengers. Maya felt herself thinking about the families waiting in Tokyo, not just Kenji's adoptive parents, but the 12 other children whose files sat in her carry-on bag. Each photograph represented years of paperwork, home visits, background checks, and careful matching based on temperament, cultural preferences, and a dozen other details that seemed insignificant now, but had once felt like the most important details in the world. There was Yuki, a 7-year-old girl who loved to draw pictures of birds and had been waiting for a family who could speak both English and Japanese. Her prospective parents, the Nakamura, lived in Portland and had converted their spare bedroom into an art studio, complete with easels and every color of paint imaginable. They'd sent Yuki a video message last month, practicing their carefully rehearsed Japanese phrases while showing off the studio. I remember how Yuki had watched that video 17 times, counting each viewing because she asked. Then there was Hiro, whose clubfoot had made him less appealing to many families, but who had captured the hearts of Dr. Sarah Williams and her wife, Jennifer, through a single video call where he demonstrated his ability to solve complex puzzles with a concentration that impressed even the orphanage staff. Sarah, an orthopedic surgeon, had already scheduled consultations with the best pediatric specialists on the West Coast. Maya pressed her forehead against the cool window and closed her eyes, trying to center herself the way her meditation teacher had shown her. But instead of finding calm, she found herself transported back to last Tuesday evening in her cramped Los Angeles apartment. She'd been on a video call with the staff at Sunshine Orphanage, reviewing final details for this trip, when 5-year-old Kenji had wandered into frame. He'd been holding a paper airplane he'd folded from a page torn from a coloring book, and he'd asked in careful, practiced English if Maya thought airplanes were magic. The question had caught her off guard. This child who'd never been on a plane, who'd never left the prefecture where he was born, somehow understanding that these metal birds represented transformation, the possibility of impossible journeys. "I think they're full of hope," she'd told him through the computer screen, watching his face light up with understanding. Now, as their own metal bird shuddered and groaned its way through whatever crisis was unfolding, Maya wondered if she'd lied to him. Maybe airplanes weren't full of hope. Maybe they were just fragile machines carrying fragile people across impossible distances, held aloft by nothing more substantial than physics and faith. The oxygen masks had stopped swaying, which somehow felt more ominous than their earlier dance. In the sudden stillness, Maya became hyper-aware of every sound: the steady whoosh of the ventilation system, the occasional crackle from the intercom, Patricia's measured footsteps as she moved through the cabin checking on passengers, and the soft sobbing that seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Miss?" The voice belonged to a teenage boy in the seat across the aisle. He was maybe 16, with dark hair that fell across his eyes and a complexion that suggested mixed heritage. "You work with kids, right? I heard you talking to the flight attendant earlier." Maya nodded, surprised by the question. "I do. Why?" "There's a little girl back there." He gestured toward the rear of the plane. "And she's really scared. Her mom is trying to keep it together, but—" He shrugged with the particular eloquence of teenagers who understand more than they let on. Without hesitation, Maya unfastened her seatbelt. Patricia appeared immediately, her professional instincts clearly on high alert. But when Maya explained the situation, she nodded and escorted them both toward the back of the plane. The little girl was maybe 4 years old, with curly red hair and enormous green eyes that were currently brimming with tears. Her mother, a woman who looked like she was fighting her own battle with panic, held her close while whispering reassurances that didn't seem to be working. Maya knelt in the aisle beside their row, ignoring the way the floor vibrated beneath her knees. "Hi there. What's your name?" "Emma." "Emma, that's a beautiful name. I'm Maya. Can you tell me what you're most scared about right now?" The question was direct, which often worked better with children than the usual adult platitudes. Emma considered it seriously, her tear-stained face scrunching with concentration. "The airplane sounds sick, like when I had a fever and couldn't stop shaking." Maya's heart clenched at the accuracy of the comparison. "You're right. The airplane doesn't feel very good right now. But you know what? Sometimes when we're sick, we have lots of people taking care of us to help us feel better. The pilots up front are like doctors for airplanes. They're doing everything they can to help our airplane feel better." Emma's mother caught Maya's eye and mouthed, "Thank you," with a gratitude so profound it was almost painful to witness. "Can I tell you a secret?" Maya continued, settling more comfortably on the vibrating floor. "I'm a little scared too, but sometimes when I'm scared, it helps me to think about something really good that's waiting for me when I'm not scared anymore." "Like what?" Emma asked, her crying reduced to occasional sniffles. Maya thought about Kenji and his paper airplane, about the Nakamura's art studio and Dr. Williams' carefully researched treatment plans. But those stories felt too complex, too laden with adult complications and years of bureaucratic struggle. "Well," she said instead, "when I get to Tokyo, I'm going to eat the most incredible bowl of ramen. It's a kind of soup with noodles, and there's this tiny restaurant that makes it with a broth that takes them 24 hours to prepare. The chef there, his name is Mr. Tanaka, and he's been making ramen for 40 years. He puts a little piece of seaweed on top that's shaped like a flower." Emma's eyes widened with interest. Why does it take so long to make soup? Because the very best things in life take time, Maya said, the words coming from some deep place of truth she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. The chef adds ingredients slowly, lets them get to know each other. He tastes it every few hours to make sure everything is balanced just right. By the time it's ready, that bowl of soup has been touched by so much care and attention that it tastes like a warm hug from someone who really loves you. The plane gave another lurch, but Emma didn't start crying again. Instead, she looked thoughtful. What else are you going to do in Tokyo? I'm going to meet some children who are waiting for their families. Children who've been hoping and dreaming for a really long time to find people who will love them exactly as they are. And tomorrow, their dreams are going to come true. The teenage boy who'd alerted her to Emma's distress had followed them back and was now listening with the kind of intense attention that suggested he understood more about hope and waiting than most adults twice his age. Maya wondered about his story, about what had taught him to notice the pain of others and care enough to act on it. "Are you scared they won't like you?" Emma asked, with the brutal honesty of childhood. I laughed, a sound that surprised her with its genuine warmth despite their circumstances. "A little bit, but mostly I'm excited because I know they're going to be amazing, and I get to help them find their way home." Patricia appeared beside them, her expression more relaxed than it had been since the captain's first announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Our engineering team has managed to restore partial hydraulic pressure. We're going to be making an unscheduled landing in Anchorage for a full systems check, but our situation has stabilized considerably." The collective exhale from the passenger cabin was audible, like the entire plane releasing a breath it had been holding. But Maya noticed that Patricia's relief, while genuine, carried an undercurrent of something else. Professional caution, maybe, or the knowledge that stabilized was a relative term when you were 7 miles above the Pacific Ocean. Emma's mother was crying now, but these were different tears, the kind that come when terror transforms into relief so quickly that your body doesn't know how to process the transition. The teenage boy across the aisle had slumped back into his seat, the careful composure he'd maintained throughout the crisis finally cracking to reveal his actual age. "Will you still go eat that soup?" Emma asked Maya, her small hand reaching out to touch Maya's arm. "I absolutely will," Maya promised. "And when I do, I'll think about a very brave little girl named Emma who helped me remember that the best things in life are worth waiting for even when we're scared." But as Maya made her way back to row 23, gathering her scattered papers and photographs, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much larger and more complex than a mechanical failure. The way Patricia had looked when the captain announced their improved status, the slight hesitation in the pilot's voice, the particular quality of the plane's vibrations, all of it suggested layers of truth that hadn't yet been revealed. She settled back into her seat beside the elderly Japanese man, who was now smiling peacefully, his prayer book closed in his lap. Outside the window, the Pacific stretched endless and blue, beautiful and terrifying in its vastness. "Are you a mother?" he asked quietly in accented English. Maya shook her head. "Not in the traditional sense, but I help children find their mothers, and mothers find their children." He nodded, as if this made perfect sense. "The universe has a way of putting the right people in the right places," he said, "even when we don't understand why we're there." As Flight 447 began its descent toward Anchorage, Maya found herself thinking about his words, about the strange confluence of events that had placed her in row 23 at this exact moment in time. She thought about Emma's question, whether the children she was traveling to meet would like her, and realized that the more important question might be whether she would prove worthy of their trust. In her carry-on bag, 13 files waited, each one representing a child who had already survived more disappointment and loss than most adults would face in a lifetime. They were counting on her not just to facilitate their adoptions, but to understand the weight of what they were entrusting to her care, their hopes, their fears, their carefully guarded dreams of belonging somewhere to someone in a way that felt permanent and safe. The captain's voice returned, steady and professional. "Flight attendants, prepare for descent into Ted Stevens Anchorage International Airport. We should be on the ground in approximately 30 minutes. 30 minutes to Anchorage. Then, however many hours it would take to resolve their mechanical issues, rebook connections, and continue on to Tokyo." Maya calculated the delays in her head. They would miss their scheduled arrival by at least 12 hours, maybe more. She would need to make phone calls, reschedule meetings, reassure anxious adopted families that this was just a temporary setback. But as she watched the Alaskan coastline appear outside her window, Maya realized that some part of her wasn't entirely disappointed by the delay. Something about the last hour had shifted her perspective in a way she couldn't yet articulate. The conversation with Emma, the teenage boy's quiet compassion, Patricia's steady professionalism in the face of crisis. All of it had reminded her of why she'd chosen this work in the first place. It wasn't about the paperwork or the bureaucratic procedures or even the successful placements that looked so satisfying in her annual reports. It was about the moments when hope and reality intersected, when people found the courage to care for each other despite uncertainty, despite risk, despite all the ways that love could disappoint or hurt or fail to last. As the wheels touched down on the Anchorage runway with a gentle thump that felt like the most beautiful sound in the world, Maya closed her eyes and made a silent promise to the 13 children whose photographs were scattered across her lap. Whatever was waiting for them in the days ahead, whatever complications or challenges or unexpected revelations might emerge, she would be present for all of it, not just as their advocate or their liaison, but as someone who understood that the most important journeys were rarely smooth, and that sometimes the turbulence was what taught you to appreciate solid ground. The plane taxied to the gate with mechanical groans that no longer sounded ominous, just tired. Around her, passengers began the familiar ritual of gathering belongings and preparing to disembark, their earlier fear already transforming into stories they would tell their families, adventures survived, and lessons learned. But Maya remained in her seat for a moment longer, watching Patricia help Emma and her mother gather their things, observing the way the teenage boy waited patiently for the elderly Japanese man to retrieve his prayer book from the overhead compartment. These small acts of consideration, almost invisible in their ordinariness, felt suddenly profound. Whatever had gone wrong with Flight 447's hydraulic systems, whatever mechanical failure had brought them to this unplanned stop in Alaska, Maya found herself strangely grateful for it. Sometimes she thought, the universe does put you exactly where you need to be, especially when, you have no idea why you're there. Maya's hotel room in Anchorage smelled like industrial disinfectant and the ghost of 1,000 other travelers' stories. She sat cross-legged on the scratchy bedspread, her laptop balanced on her knees, making the first of what would be many difficult phone calls. The time difference between Alaska and Tokyo meant she'd be working through the night, but that was nothing new. In 8 years of facilitating international adoptions, she'd learned to exist in multiple time zones simultaneously, her circadian rhythms permanently disrupted by the urgent need to coordinate between desperate parents and vulnerable children across vast distances. "Mrs. Nakamura? This is Maya Chen. I'm calling about Yuki's placement." She kept her voice steady, professional, even though her hands still trembled slightly from the afternoon's near disaster. "We've encountered a mechanical issue with our flight, so I won't be arriving until tomorrow evening at the earliest." The silence on the other end stretched long enough for Maya to picture Yuki's prospective mother, probably standing in the art studio they'd so carefully prepared, surrounded by easels and paints and dreams that had been 3 years in the making. Is everything all right?" Mrs. Nakamura's voice carried the particular fragility of someone who had learned not to trust good fortune. "Everything is fine," Maya assured her, surprised by how true the words felt. "Just a delay. These ends happen with international travel. Yuki is safe and well, and she's as excited to meet you as you are to meet her." It was a small lie, the kind Maya told regularly in her work, not because she enjoyed deception, but because hope was often more fragile than people realized, and sometimes the truth needed to be delivered in carefully measured doses. The reality was that 7-year-old Yuki was terrified. She'd been disappointed before, had met other families who'd seemed promising until they'd decided she wasn't quite what they'd been hoping for.
Too quiet, they'd said. Not affectionate enough. As if a child who'd spent most of her life in institutional care should be expected to immediately trust strangers with her heart. Maya had spent hours with Yuki during her last visit to Sunshine Orphanage, sitting in the courtyard while the little girl drew intricate pictures of birds in flight. Each drawing was meticulously detailed. The curve of wings, the sharp focus of eyes, the careful attention to shadows and light that suggested an artist's soul trapped in a child's body. "Why do you always draw birds?" Maya had asked during one of their sessions. Yuki had looked up from her sketchpad, her expression serious beyond her years. "Because they can go anywhere they want to, and they always know how to find their way home." The conversation had broken Maya's heart in the specific way that happened when children revealed their deepest needs through seemingly innocent comments. Yuki wasn't just drawing birds, she was drawing freedom, possibility, the hope that someday she too would know where home was supposed to be. After reassuring the Nakamuras and making similar calls to 4 other families, Maya finally allowed herself to lean back against the hotel room's flimsy headboard and close her eyes. The afternoon's events played on repeat behind her eyelids. The captain's cracked voice, Emma's tear-stained face, Patricia's steady competence in the face of crisis. But most of all, she found herself thinking about the moment when she'd knelt in the airplane aisle and realized that her own fear had transformed into something else entirely. For the first time in months, maybe years, she'd been fully present in her body, fully aware of her own emotions rather than simply managing everyone else's. It was a strange revelation for someone whose job required constant emotional availability, the ability to absorb and redirect the anxiety, hope, grief, and joy of dozens of families simultaneously. Maya's phone buzzed with a text from her younger sister Jen. "Saw the news about Flight 447. Are you okay?" She stared at the message for a long moment before responding. "Fine. Delayed in Anchorage. Long story."
But even as she typed the words, Maya realized they weren't entirely accurate. She was fine in the sense that she was physically unharmed, that her work would continue, that the 13 adoptions she was facilitating would still happen eventually. But something fundamental had shifted during those terrifying minutes at 30,000 feet, something she couldn't quite name yet, but could feel pulsing beneath her professional composure like a second heartbeat. Her phone rang again, this time the international number for Sunshine Orphanage. "Maya-san?" The voice belonged to Hiroko Sato, the orphanage director who had become both a colleague and something approaching a friend over the years. "We heard about the flight. Are you hurt?" "No, I'm fine. Just stuck in Alaska for the night." She switched to Japanese, a language that still felt slightly foreign on her tongue despite years of study, but that carried emotional nuances English sometimes missed. "How are the children? Are they worried?" "Some of them saw the news reports. Kenji asked if airplanes sometimes get too tired to fly." Maya smiled, despite her exhaustion. Of course Kenji would understand mechanical failure in terms of tiredness. At 5 years old, he still took afternoon naps when the grief of missing parents he couldn't quite remember became too heavy to carry while awake. "Tell him that airplanes are like people," Maya said. "Sometimes they need to rest, so they can keep taking care of everyone safely." He also asked if you were still coming to bring him to his new family. The question hit Maya with unexpected force. In all the phone calls she'd made to adopted families, she'd focused on reassuring them that the delays wouldn't affect their children's placements, but she hadn't considered how the children themselves might be processing the news, whether they would interpret a mechanical failure as evidence that the universe was conspiring against their happiness once again. "Tell him yes," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "Tell him that nothing, absolutely nothing, will stop me from keeping that promise." After ending the call with Hiroko, Maya found herself pacing the small hotel room, her body suddenly too restless for sleep, despite the day's emotional exhaustion. She thought about Kenji's question, about the weight of promises made to children who had already learned that adults were not always reliable,
that hope was a luxury they couldn't afford to invest in too heavily. The truth was that Maya had entered this profession partly because of her own childhood experiences with disappointment and abandonment. Her parents had divorced when she was 8, a messy separation that had involved lawyers and custody battles, and the kind of collateral damage that happened when adults prioritized their own pain over their children's stability. She'd spent years shuttling between households, never quite belonging fully in either, always feeling like a visitor in her own life. The irony was not lost on her that she now spent her days helping create the kind of stable, loving families she desperately wanted as a child. But it was more than irony. It was intentional, a conscious choice to transform her own wounds into a source of healing for others. Every successful placement felt like a small victory against the chaos that had defined her early years. Proof that love could triumph over loss if you were patient enough and careful enough and willing to do the hard work of matching people's deepest needs with their capacity to meet each other's needs. Maya's laptop chimed with an email from Dr. Sarah Williams, the orthopedic surgeon who was adopting Hiro, the boy with the club foot. The subject line read, "Delayed but not discouraged," and Maya opened it with a smile already tugging at her lips. "Maya, Jennifer and I heard about the flight delays. We hope you're safe and comfortable.
Wherever you are, we wanted you to know that we've used the extra time to baby-proof the house. Yes, we know Hiro is 8, but Jennifer insists on being thorough and to practice our Japanese. Jennifer has been watching YouTube videos and can now say I love you in Japanese, although she admits she might be accidentally ordering sushi. We trust your judgment completely and know that everything happens for a reason. Give Hiro our love and tell him we're counting down the hours until we can finally hug him. With gratitude and excitement, Sarah and Jennifer." Maya found herself blinking back tears at the email's genuine warmth. Dr. Williams and her wife had waited 4 years for this adoption, jumping through hoops that included extensive home studies, psychological evaluations, medical examinations, and more paperwork than most people generated in a lifetime. They'd been rejected by 2 other children's birth families, not because there was anything wrong with them, but because the cultural and linguistic barriers felt too overwhelming for families already dealing with the trauma of relinquishing their children. But Hiro had been different. When Maya had shown him photos of Sarah and Jennifer's home, the carefully modified bathroom with grab bars and non-slip surfaces, the bedroom they'd painted his favorite shade of blue, the backyard with a garden where Jennifer grew the Japanese vegetables she'd learned to cook in preparation for his arrival, something had shifted in his expression. Hope, maybe, or recognition. The understanding that these women had spent years preparing to love him exactly as he was, clubfoot and all. "They look kind," he'd said in careful English, tracing his finger along the edge of Jennifer's smile in the photograph. The comment had nearly broken Maya's professional composure. In Japan, visible disabilities still carried significant social stigma, and Hiro had internalized the message that his club foot made him less desirable, less worthy of love. The fact that Sarah, a surgeon who specialized in correcting exactly his condition, saw his foot not as a flaw, but as something easily treatable, had been a revelation for him. Maya closed the laptop and walked to the hotel room's single window, looking out at the Alaskan twilight that seemed to stretch endlessly across the sky. The view was nothing like Los Angeles, where she'd lived for the past 8 years, or Tokyo, where she spent at least 2 weeks of every month. Alaska felt like the edge of the world, a place where normal rules didn't apply and time moved differently. She thought about Emma, the little girl from the plane who'd been so afraid until Maya distracted her with stories about ramen and patient chefs. There had been something about that conversation that had felt significant, though Maya couldn't quite identify why. Maybe it was the way Emma had listened so intently, or the way she'd asked whether Maya was scared the children wouldn't like her, a question that revealed a child's intuitive understanding of vulnerability, the recognition that even adults sometimes feared rejection. The truth was that Maya was scared,
Not of the children. She'd never met a child she didn't immediately love, but of the enormous responsibility she carried. These weren't just adoptions she was facilitating. They were lives she was helping to reshape, futures she was helping to determine. Every decision she made, every family she recommended, every cultural nuance she explained or failed to explain could ripple outward in ways she might never fully understand. Take Yuki, for instance. Maya had specifically chosen the Nakamuras because they were bilingual and bicultural, because they understood the importance of helping Yuki maintain her connection to her Japanese heritage while also embracing her new American identity. But what if Maya had misread something? What if the family dynamics weren't as stable as they appeared during home visits? What if Yuki's quietness wasn't just shyness, but a sign of deeper emotional issues that would require more support than the Nakamuras were prepared to provide? These were the thoughts that kept Maya awake during her frequent flights across the Pacific, the what-ifs and worst-case scenarios that came with the territory of working with vulnerable children and hopeful adults. She'd learned to manage the anxiety through meditation and exercise, and the kind of compartmentalization that allowed her to function professionally while her heart was constantly breaking and healing in equal measure.
But tonight, in this anonymous hotel room thousands of miles from anywhere she'd planned to be, the usual coping mechanisms felt inadequate. The afternoon's brush with disaster had stripped away some protective layer she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying, leaving her raw and exposed in a way that was both uncomfortable and oddly liberating. Maya's phone rang again, this time an unknown number with a local area code. "Miss Chen, this is Patricia Morrison. I was your flight attendant on Flight 447 today." "Patricia, how are you? Is everything all right with the plane?" "The plane is fine. They've identified the hydraulic issue and it'll be repaired by morning. I'm actually calling because I wanted to thank you for what you did with that little girl, Emma. Her mother asked me to get your contact information. She wanted to write you a thank you note." Maya felt a warmth spread through her chest. "That's very kind, but it wasn't necessary. Anyone would have done the same thing." "Actually, that's not true," Patricia said, her voice carrying the weight of 30 years in the airline industry. "I've seen thousands of passengers in crisis situations, and most people are too consumed with their own fear to notice anyone else's. What you did today, the way you connected with that child and helped her process her fear instead of just trying to distract her from it, that was special." There was a pause, and Maya could hear background noise that sounded like a hotel restaurant or bar. "Can I ask you something?" Patricia continued. "Are you free for dinner? I know we're both stuck here overnight, and I have a feeling there's more to your story than just being a passenger on a delayed flight." Maya hesitated. She still had phone calls to make, emails to send, logistics to coordinate for tomorrow's rescheduled travel, but something in Patricia's voice, a combination of genuine curiosity and professional intuition, made her reconsider. "I'd like that," she said, surprising herself. "Where should we meet?" An hour later, Maya found herself sitting across from Patricia in the hotel's restaurant, a generic space with fake wood paneling and photographs of Alaskan wildlife that looked like they'd been ordered from a catalog. But Patricia's presence transformed the anonymous space into something warmer, more intimate. She'd changed from her flight attendant uniform into jeans and a soft blue sweater that made her look younger, more relaxed. "So," Patricia said after they'd ordered, salmon for both of them because when in Alaska, "tell me about the work you do with children. I could tell from the way you handled Emma that this isn't your first time talking a scared kid through a crisis." Maya found herself describing her work with surprising openness, explaining the complexities of international adoption, the careful process of matching families with children, and the delicate balance between hope and realism that defined every interaction. Patricia listened with the kind of focused attention that Maya realized how rarely she talked about her work with someone who wasn't either a client or a colleague. "How did you get into this?" The question was one Maya usually deflected or answered with a brief, sanitized summary of her professional qualifications. But something about the day's events, combined with Patricia's genuine interest, made her want to tell the truth. "My parents divorced when I was 8.
It was messy, complicated. I spent a lot of years feeling like I didn't really belong anywhere, like I was always a guest in someone else's family. Patricia nodded, her expression understanding rather than pitying.
I think I became interested in adoption work because I wanted to help create the kind of stability I'd wished for as a kid, but also because I understood what it felt like to be in limbo, to not know where you belonged or whether the adults in your life were going to keep their promises. And do they? Patricia asked. Keep their promises, I mean? Maya considered the question seriously. Most of the time, the families I work with have usually wanted children for years, sometimes decades. They've been through extensive screening and preparation, but adoption isn't magic. It doesn't erase a child's history of loss or automatically create perfect families. It's more like giving people a chance to choose each other, to build something new together, despite their individual wounds. Their food arrived, and they ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes before Patricia spoke again. I have 2 daughters, she said quietly, adopted from foster care when they were 6 and 8. That was 15 years ago, and I still sometimes feel like I'm figuring it out as I go. Maya looked up, surprised by the revelation. How are they now? Good, really good. The oldest is in college, studying social work. She wants to help kids like she used to be. The younger one is in high school and thinks she might want to be a pilot. Patricia smiled. She says she wants a job where she can help people get where they're supposed to go. The phrase hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning. Maya thought about her own work, about the children waiting in Tokyo, about the strange series of events that had brought her to this moment. "Can I ask you something?" Maya said. "Today, during the emergency, you seemed calm, but I got the sense that you were more worried than you let on. Was it really as bad as it felt?" Patricia was quiet for a long moment, turning her water glass in slow circles on the table. "We were in trouble," she finally admitted. "Not catastrophic, end-of-the-world trouble, but serious enough that I was running through emergency protocols in my head. The thing about aviation is that most mechanical failures are manageable if they're caught early and handled properly. But when you lose hydraulic pressure at cruising altitude, let's just say I was very grateful when the engineers managed to restore partial function." Maya felt a chill run down her spine. "So when you told me everything was going to be okay, I believed it," Patricia said firmly. "But belief and certainty aren't the same thing. Sometimes you have to act on faith while you're working toward facts." The observation felt profound in a way that extended far beyond aviation mechanics. Maya thought about her own work, about the leap of faith required every time she matched a child with a family, every time she promised a happy ending while knowing that life rarely followed such predictable patterns. Is that what you were doing with Emma? Acting on faith while working toward facts? Maya considered the question. "I think I was trying to help her understand that being scared doesn't mean being powerless, that sometimes the best way through fear is to focus on what we're looking forward to on the other side of it." "And what are you looking forward to?" The question caught Maya off guard. She was so accustomed to focusing on other people's hopes and dreams that she rarely examined her own. For a moment, she felt exposed, as if Patricia had somehow seen through the professional competence she wore like armor. Honestly, Maya set down her fork and leaned back in her chair. "I'm looking forward to seeing Kenji's face when he meets his new parents. He's 5 years old and he's been at the orphanage since he was 2. His birth mother was a teenager who couldn't care for him, and his father was never in the picture. For 3 years, he's watched other children get adopted while he waited." She paused, surprised by the emotion in her own voice. "But his adoptive parents, the Yamadas, they specifically requested an older child. They've been married for 12 years and struggled with infertility. When they decided to adopt, they said they wanted a child who had been waiting, who needed them as much as they needed him. They've been preparing for months, learning children's songs, researching child development, turning their spare room into the most amazing bedroom I've ever seen." Patricia smiled. "It sounds like a perfect match." "On paper, yes.
But the thing about adoption is that it's not really about matching people like puzzle pieces. It's about giving them the space and support to figure out how to love each other, even when it's complicated or difficult or not what they expected. Maya found herself thinking about her own parents again, about the way their marriage had dissolved when the reality of daily life together became more challenging than the fantasy they'd initially fallen in love with. The difference, she'd learned through her work, was that adoptive families entered the relationship understanding that love was a choice that had to be made repeatedly, consciously, especially when things got difficult. "You sound like you speak from experience," Patricia observed gently. "My parents' divorce taught me that love without commitment is just a feeling, and feelings change. But commitment without love is just obligation, and that's not sustainable either. The families I work with, the successful ones, they understand that adoption is both. It's choosing to love a specific child, and then doing the daily work to make that choice real and lasting." They finished dinner as the Alaskan sky finally began to darken, though even at nearly 10 o'clock, the light had a quality that suggested dawn rather than dusk. Patricia insisted on paying, saying it was the least she could do after Maya had helped with Emma during the emergency. As they waited for the elevator, Patricia turned to Maya with an expression that was both thoughtful and slightly concerned. "Can I ask you something that might be too personal?" Maya nodded, curious. "When was the last time someone took care of you the way you take care of everyone else?" The question hit Maya like a physical blow, not because it was cruel, but because it was accurate. She opened her mouth to deflect or make a joke, but found herself speechless. "I don't mean to pry. It's just that I recognize the signs. I spent years taking care of everyone else, passengers, crew members, my daughters, before I realized I'd forgotten how to let anyone take care of me." The elevator arrived and they rode up in comfortable silence. At Maya's floor, Patricia gave Maya a gentle hug that smelled like vanilla perfume and the kind of warmth that comes from someone who has learned to balance strength with vulnerability. "Get some sleep," Patricia said. "And Maya, those kids you're traveling to help, they're lucky to have someone who cares as much as you do. But don't forget that you deserve that same kind of care." Alone in her hotel room again, Maya sat on the edge of the bed and stared in her reflection in the dark window. Patricia's question echoed in her mind. When was the last time someone had taken care of her?
The honest answer was that she couldn't remember. Oh, there had been boyfriends over the years, colleagues who'd covered for her when she was traveling, her sister Jen who sent care packages and worried about her irregular schedule. But those gestures, while appreciated, felt different from the kind of care Patricia was talking about. The deep, attentive presence that asked not just what do you need, but who are you when you're not taking care of everyone else? Maya's laptop sat open on the desk, 17 unread emails glowing accusingly in the dim light. Tomorrow would bring more phone calls, more logistics, more careful management of other people's hopes and fears. But for the first time in years, she found herself wondering what would happen if she allowed herself to be as vulnerable as the children and families she served. If she admitted that she sometimes felt as lost and scared and desperate for belonging as any of them. She thought about Kenji and his paper airplane, about his question whether airplanes were magic. Maybe they weren't magic, but maybe they were something just as important. Vehicles for transformation, machines that carried people across impossible distances, not just geographically, but emotionally. Maybe that's what today had been, not a mechanical failure, but a necessary detour that had forced her to examine parts of herself she'd been too busy to notice. Maya pulled out her phone and scrolled to her sister's earlier text. Instead of her usual brief response, she typed, "The flight was scary, but I'm okay, really okay, in a way I haven't been for a while. Can we talk when I get back? I have things I want to tell you." She hit send before she could second-guess herself, then closed the laptop without reading any of the waiting emails. They would still be there in the morning, along with all the responsibilities and commitments that defined her professional life. But tonight, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Maya Chen was going to take care of herself, starting with 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep and the radical act of trusting that the world would continue spinning without her constant attention. As she drifted off to sleep, Maya found herself thinking about ramen again. Not the story she told Emma about Mr. Tanaka's 24-hour broth, but the deeper truth behind it.
The very best things in life really did take time, required patience and attention, and the willingness to let ingredients slowly transform each other until they became something richer and more complex than they'd been individually. Maybe that was what she'd been doing all these years without realizing it. Not just facilitating adoptions, but participating in a kind of alchemy where love and loss and hope and time combined to create families that were stronger precisely because they hadn't come easily. And maybe, just maybe, it was time for her to stop being only the facilitator and start being someone who was open to that same kind of transformation herself. Maya's phone rang at 3:47 a.m. Anchorage time, with the piercing urgency that could only mean crisis. She fumbled for it in the darkness, her heart already racing with the particular dread that came from years of managing emergencies across multiple time zones. Hiroko Sato's voice was strained, tight with the kind of controlled panic Maya had learned to recognize in people who worked with vulnerable children. "Maya-san, we have a problem." Maya sat up in bed, instantly alert despite the few hours of sleep she had managed. "What has happened? Are the children okay?" "The children are fine, but—" Hiroko's voice broke slightly. "Maya-san, there's been an investigation. Social services came to the orphanage yesterday evening, just after I spoke with you. They're questioning our adoption procedures, our screening processes. They're saying there may have been irregularities in some of our international placements." The words hit Maya like ice water. In 8 years of facilitating adoptions, she'd seen investigations before. They were an unfortunate but sometimes necessary part of child welfare work. But the timing felt ominous, coming just hours after Flight 447's emergency landing, as if the universe was testing her resolve in every possible way. "What kind of irregularities?" Maya asked, already reaching for her laptop with her free hand. "They won't give us specifics, just that they've received complaints about our processes, questions about whether we're properly vetting adoptive families or if we're prioritizing speed over the children's best interests. Maya-san, they've suspended all international adoptions pending their review." Maya's blood ran cold. "All of them? Including the 13 placements I'm coordinating?" "All of them. I'm so sorry. I know how hard you've worked, how much these families have invested emotionally and financially, but until the investigation is complete—" "How long?" Maya interrupted, her mind already racing through the implications. "How long will the investigation take?" "They won't say. Weeks, maybe months. Maya-san, I've been running this orphanage for 15 years. I've never had a complaint about our procedures, never had a placement go wrong in any significant way. I don't understand where this is coming from." Maya closed her eyes, trying to process the information. 13 families who had been preparing for years to welcome their children. 13 children who had been told their forever families were finally coming. All of it now suspended indefinitely based on anonymous complaints and bureaucratic suspicion. "Have you contacted your legal team?" Maya asked. "Of course, but they say our best strategy is to cooperate fully with the investigation, to provide whatever documentation they request, and to wait." "Maya-san, what do I tell the children? What do I tell the families who have traveled here expecting to meet their children today?" The question hung in the air like a weight. Maya thought about Dr. Williams and her wife Jennifer, probably awake in their hotel room in Tokyo right now, checking their phones every few minutes for updates about their delayed meeting with Hiro. She thought about the Nakamuras, who had taken time off work and prepared themselves emotionally for Yuki's arrival. Most of all, she thought about Kenti and his paper airplane, about his question whether airplanes were magic, and her promise that nothing would stop her from keeping her word. "Don't tell the children anything yet," Maya said finally. "Let me make some calls, see if I can find out more about what's driving this investigation. Maybe there's been a misunderstanding, or maybe it's focused on procedures that don't affect our current placements." But even as she said the words, Maya knew she was grasping at optimistic straws. In her experience, child welfare investigations were rarely based on misunderstandings, and they almost never moved quickly toward resolution. The system was designed to be cautious above all else, to err on the side of protecting children, even when that meant causing heartbreak for adults who had invested everything in the hope of building families. After ending the call with Hiroko, Maya sat in the darkness of her hotel room and tried to think strategically. She dealt with bureaucratic obstacles before, had learned to navigate the complex web of regulations and personalities that governed international adoption, but this felt different, more serious, more potentially devastating to everyone involved. She opened her laptop and began searching for news about Sunshine Orphanage, looking for any recent articles or reports that might explain the sudden investigation. What she found made her stomach clench with dread. The first article was dated just 2 days ago, published in a Tokyo newspaper under the headline, "Questions Raised About International Adoption Practices." The piece was carefully written, full of the kind of cautious language journalists used when they were skating close to legal liability, but the implications were clear.
According to the article, an anonymous whistleblower had contacted child welfare authorities with concerns about several orphanages in the Tokyo area, including Sunshine. The complaints centered around allegations that these institutions were rushing adoptions, failing to properly screen international families, and prioritizing financial considerations over children's welfare. Maya read the article twice, her hands trembling with a combination of anger and fear. The allegations were vague enough to be difficult to refute, but serious enough to trigger an investigation that could take months to resolve. Worse, the article mentioned that authorities were reviewing recent adoptions to determine if any children had been placed inappropriately. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Williams. "Maya, we've seen the news reports. Are the allegations true? Should we be worried about Hiro?" Before Maya could formulate a response, another text arrived, this one from Mrs. Nakamura. "The orphanage called to say there are delays with the adoption process. No one will tell us what's happening. We're scared." Then another, and another. Within minutes, Maya's phone was flooded with messages from concerned adoptive families, all asking variations of the same desperate questions. What was happening? Were their adoptions at risk? Had they been deceived about the legitimacy of their placements? Maya stared at the screen, paralyzed by the enormity of what she was facing. 13 families in various stages of panic, 13 children whose futures had suddenly become uncertain again, and a professional reputation she'd spent 8 years building, now potentially in ruins based on anonymous allegations she couldn't even properly defend against. She was still staring at her phone when it rang again. This time, a number she recognized as belonging to Marcus Webb, the director of her adoption agency in Los Angeles. "Maya, thank God you're awake. I've been trying to reach you for hours." "Marcus, I just found out about the investigation. I'm trying to figure out what—" "It's worse than you know, Marcus. It's worse than you know, Marcus," interrupted, his voice grim. "I've been getting calls all night from other agencies, other facilitators working in Japan. This isn't just about Sunshine Orphanage. The investigation seems to be targeting the entire network of international adoption services operating out of Tokyo." Maya felt the blood drain from her face. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying someone has made very serious allegations about systemic problems with international adoptions from Japan, allegations that could shut down the entire program if they're substantiated. Maya, they're not just questioning current placements, they're reviewing cases going back 3 years. 3 years. Maya quickly calculated how many adoptions she'd facilitated in that time frame. 47 children placed with families across the United States. 47 families whose lives had been transformed. Children who had found stability and love and futures they'd never dreamed possible. Marcus, you know our work. You know how carefully we screen families, how thorough our processes are. These allegations— "I know," Marcus said quietly, "but knowing the truth and being able to prove it in the face of a formal investigation are two different things. Maya, I need you to come home immediately. We need to start gathering documentation, preparing our defense,
figuring out how to protect our families and our reputation. I can't leave now. The families are here. The children are expecting. The children are not going anywhere for the foreseeable future, and the families need to understand that this situation has changed everything. Maya, I'm not suggesting this lightly, but if these allegations gain traction, if the media picks up the story in a bigger way, we could be looking at criminal charges, not just administrative sanctions.
Criminal charges. The words echoed in Maya's mind as she tried to process their implications. She thought about Patricia's question from the night before. When was the last time someone had taken care of her? And realized with bitter irony that she was about to find out exactly how alone she really was. "What kind of criminal charges?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "Child endangerment, if they can prove we placed children with inappropriate families. Fraud, if they can show we misrepresented information to facilitate adoptions. Maya, I've been in this business for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like this. Someone is targeting international adoption in a very systematic, very deliberate way." Maya closed her eyes and tried to think clearly despite the panic rising in her throat. Who would do something like this? Who benefits from shutting down international adoption? Could be anyone. Domestic adoption agencies who see international programs as competition, political groups who oppose international adoption on principle. Hell, it could be someone with a personal grudge against one of our families or children. The point is, we're under attack, and we need to respond strategically. And the families? What do I tell them? Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. The truth, that there's been a delay, that we're cooperating with authorities, that we believe the allegations are baseless, but that we need time to prove it. And Maya, you need to be prepared for the possibility that some of these adoptions may not happen at all. The words hit Maya like a physical blow. She thought about Kenji's paper airplane, about the promise she'd made to him and to herself. She thought about Yuki's carefully detailed drawings of birds in flight, about Hiro's hope that he might finally find a family who wouldn't be ashamed of his club foot. "I can't tell them that," she whispered. "I can't tell these children that their families aren't coming after all." "You may not have a choice." After ending the call with Marcus, Maya sat in the darkness of her hotel room and allowed herself 5 minutes to fall apart completely. She cried for the children who had already suffered so much loss, for the families who had invested years of hope and thousands of dollars in pursuing these adoptions, for her own professional reputation and the career she'd built around the belief that love could transcend borders and bureaucracy. But after 5 minutes, she wiped her tears and started making a list. First, she would call each of the 13 adoptive families individually, explaining the situation as clearly as possible without destroying their hope entirely. She would give them the facts she had, acknowledge the uncertainty she couldn't resolve, and assure them that she would fight with everything she had to see their adoptions through. Second, she would book a flight back to Los Angeles, not to abandon the families and children in Tokyo, but to begin building the legal and documentary defense that might be their only hope of moving forward. Third, she would find out who was behind these allegations and why they were targeting international adoption with such apparent coordination and malice. Maya had spent 8 years helping other people navigate the most difficult and emotionally fraught process of their lives. She'd learned to remain calm in crisis, to find solutions when none seemed possible, to hold space for other people's hope when her own felt fragile. Now, for the first time, she was the one who needed help, and she had no idea how to ask for it or whether anyone would answer if she did. But as she began drafting emails to the adoptive families, Maya found herself thinking about the conversation with Patricia the night before, about the importance of acting on faith while working toward facts.
She didn't know how this crisis would resolve, didn't know if she would be able to keep the promises she'd made to children and families who trusted her completely.
What she did know was that giving up wasn't an option. Not for Kenji, who had been waiting 3 years for a family. Not for Yuki, whose art reflected a soul that understood both freedom and the deep need for home. Not for Hiroki, who deserved parents who saw his medical needs as easily solved problems rather than insurmountable obstacles. Maya opened her laptop and began typing the most difficult emails of her professional career, choosing each word carefully as she tried to balance honesty with hope, transparency with the kind of strength that other people needed to see in order to maintain their own courage. "Dear Dr. Williams and Jennifer," she began, "I'm writing to inform you of a development that will delay Hiroki's adoption, though I want to be clear from the outset that this delay does not reflect any concerns about your fitness as parents or Hiroki's eagerness to join your family." As she wrote, Maya realized that she was doing more than just managing a crisis. She was fighting for something that mattered more than her professional reputation or even her personal comfort. She was fighting for the right of children and families to choose each other across borders and cultures, for the possibility that love could be stronger than bureaucracy, for the belief that hope was worth defending even when it seemed impossibly fragile. Outside her hotel room window, the Alaskan dawn was finally breaking, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that reminded Maya of Yuki's careful watercolors. Somewhere in Tokyo, 13 children were waking up to another day of uncertainty, probably wondering if this would finally be the day their new families arrived. Maya couldn't give them that certainty. Not today, maybe not for many days to come, but she could give them her promise that she wouldn't stop fighting, wouldn't stop believing that they deserved families who would love them exactly as they were, wouldn't stop working to make their dreams of belonging come true. It was a small promise in the face of such enormous obstacles, but Maya had learned through years of this work that sometimes small promises, faithfully kept, were powerful enough to change the world. Marcus leaned forward, his face a mixture of relief and rage. "Are you saying that none of the allegations were true? That this entire investigation was based on lies?" "That's correct. We've been investigating Mr. Yamamoto for 3 weeks, ever since anomalies in the complaint patterns suggested possible fraud. His confession has been corroborated by digital evidence, including emails he sent to multiple child welfare offices under assumed identities." Maya felt as if the floor had shifted beneath her chair. Relief and fury warred in her chest, relief that the children and families she'd been serving weren't victims of systemic abuse, fury that one person's twisted ideology had caused so much suffering for so many innocent people. "What happens now?" she managed to ask. "All administrative holds on adoptions processed through the affected agencies will be lifted immediately. The children you were working with can proceed with their placements as soon as the paperwork is processed. I understand this has been an extraordinarily difficult period for everyone involved." After ending the call with Detective Tanaka, Maya and Marcus sat in stunned silence for many minutes. The relief was overwhelming, but it was complicated by the realization of how much damage had been done in the past 12 days. "Jesus Christ," Marcus finally said, running his hands through his hair. 12 days of hell because one bitter ex-employee decided to play God with people's lives. Maya's phone was already buzzing with messages. The news was spreading quickly through the network of agencies and facilitators who had been affected by the investigation. But her first instinct wasn't to celebrate or even to feel relief. It was to think about the children who had spent nearly 2 weeks wondering if their families were still coming, if they were still wanted, if they would spend the rest of their childhood in institutional care after all. "I need to get back to Tokyo," she said, already reaching for her laptop to check flight schedules. The Yamadas were probably at their hotel right now, wondering if they'll ever get to meet Kenji. Dr. Williams and her wife have been checking their phones every hour for updates about Hiro. And Yuki, Maya's voice broke slightly. Yuki has been drawing pictures of empty houses because she thinks her family decided they don't want her after all.
Marcus nodded, understanding in his eyes. Okay, but you're not going alone this time. I'm coming with you. We need to debrief with Hiroko about what happened, review our procedures to make sure something like this can't happen again, and frankly, you've been carrying too much of this burden by yourself. The flight to Tokyo felt different from any Maya had taken before. Instead of the usual anxiety about logistics and schedules, she found herself processing the emotional whiplash of the past 2 weeks. The terror of Flight 447's emergency landing seemed like it had happened in another lifetime, though it had been less than 2 weeks ago. That crisis had stripped away her professional detachment and forced her to confront her own vulnerability. This crisis had done something else entirely. It had revealed the depth of her commitment to the children and families she served, and the recognition that her work was about much more than successful placements and satisfied clients. During the 14-hour flight, Maya found herself writing in a journal for the first time in years, trying to process everything that had happened. She wrote about the moment when she had knelt beside Emma on the floor of the airplane and realized that her own fear had transformed into fierce protective instincts. She wrote about her conversation with Patricia, about the question that had haunted her for 2 weeks. When was the last time someone took care of you?
Most importantly, she wrote about what she'd learned about herself during the darkest days of the investigation, when it had seemed like her career and reputation might be destroyed by circumstances completely beyond her control. She'd discovered reserves of strength and determination she hadn't known she possessed. But she'd also discovered how much her identity had become wrapped up in her professional success, how little support she'd allowed into her personal life. Maya had always prided herself on being the calm presence others could rely on during crisis, the person who had answers and solutions and unwavering confidence. But the past 2 weeks had taught her that vulnerability wasn't weakness. It was the foundation of genuine connection, the thing that allowed people to truly care for each other instead of just managing each other's needs. The plane began its descent into Narita Airport as the sun rose over Tokyo, painting the city in the same soft gold that had colored the Alaskan dawn 2 weeks earlier. Maya pressed her face to the window and thought about all the journeys that had brought her to this moment. Not just the physical flights across the Pacific, but the emotional distances she'd traveled in such a short time. Marcus touched her shoulder gently. "You ready for this?" Maya nodded, though ready felt like an inadequate word for what she was feeling. She was nervous about facing the families whose trust she'd had to test during the investigation. She was excited about finally being able to deliver the good news they'd all been waiting for. Most of all, she was determined to ensure that the next phase of these adoptions would be handled with even more care and attention than usual, to make up for the additional trauma everyone had endured. At the airport, Maya was surprised to see Hiroko Sato waiting for them at the arrivals gate, her usually composed face bright with relief and something that looked like pride. "Maya-san," Hiroko said, embracing her with unusual warmth, "I have been so eager to see you. The children have been asking about you every day since we received word that the investigation was resolved." "How are they handling everything?" Maya asked as they walked toward the taxi stand. "Better than I expected, honestly. Children are more resilient than we sometimes give them credit for. But they need to see you, to hear from you directly that their families are still coming. Kenji especially. He's been carrying that paper airplane you told me about everywhere he goes. He says it's his good luck charm for when his new parents arrive." The mention of Kenji's paper airplane made Maya's throat tight with emotion. She thought about his question 2 weeks ago, whether airplanes were magic, and realized that maybe they were, in their own way. Not because they defied physics, but because they carried people across impossible distances to find each other, because they made connections possible that would otherwise never exist. The drive to Sunshine Orphanage took them through Tokyo's morning rush hour, the familiar chaos of millions of people beginning their day with purpose and determination.
Maya watched the city wake up around them and felt something settle in her chest that had been restless for weeks. She was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do, with people who understood the weight and joy of the work they shared. At the orphanage, Maya was overwhelmed by the children's response to her arrival. Yuki, who was typically reserved with adults, ran directly into her arms with a picture she'd drawn of an airplane surrounded by hearts. Hito showed her a letter he had written in careful English to Dr. Williams and Jennifer, telling them about his excitement to finally meet them. And Kenji, 5-year-old Kenji with his serious dark eyes and careful questions, simply took her hand and said, "Maya-san, I knew you would come back. The airplane told me." But it was the conversation with the adoptive families that proved most challenging and ultimately most meaningful. Maya had expected anger, accusations, demands for explanations about why their dreams had been put on hold for 2 weeks based on completely fabricated allegations. Instead, she found understanding, patience, and a deeper appreciation for the complexities of the work she was doing. Dr. Sarah Williams and her wife Jennifer had used the delay to learn more Japanese phrases and to research additional resources for supporting Hiro's medical needs. The Nakamuras had spent the time creating a more detailed plan for helping Yuki maintain connections to her Japanese heritage while embracing her American identity. The Yamadas had simply waited with the kind of patient faith that suggested they understood that some things worth having were worth waiting for, even when the waiting was inexplicable and painful. "We knew from the beginning that this process would have challenges," Mrs. Yamada told Maya during their meeting at the orphanage. "What we didn't expect was how much this experience would teach us about our own resilience, about how much we really want this. If anything, the delay has made us more certain that Kenji is meant to be our son." One by one, over the course of 3 days, Maya witnessed the meetings she'd been trying to make happen for months. She watched Kenji's face light up when he met the Yamadas, saw the instant recognition between Hiro and Dr. Williams when she knelt down to his level and spoke to him in careful Japanese about the adventures they would have together. Most powerfully, she observed Yuki's gradual warming to the Nakamuras, culminating in the moment when she shyly offered to draw them a picture of their family as birds flying together toward the same destination. Each meeting was different, reflecting the unique personalities and circumstances of the children and families involved. But all of them shared certain elements that Maya had learned to recognize as markers of successful adoptions: genuine curiosity rather than predetermined expectations, patience with the awkwardness of first meetings, and the kind of attention that communicated to children that they were valued for who they were rather than who they might become. On her last day at the orphanage, Maya sat in the courtyard where she'd spent so many hours getting to know the children over the past months. The space felt different now, lighter somehow, filled with the kind of hopeful energy that came when possibilities became realities. Hiroko joined her on the bench where she'd watched Yuki draw her intricate birds, where she'd helped Kenji fold paper airplanes, where she'd listened to Hiro's questions about America and whether his new parents would really love him despite his medical needs. "Maya-san," Hiroko said quietly, "I want you to know something. During the investigation, when everything seemed so uncertain, I watched you fight for these children and families with a dedication that went beyond professional obligation. You could have protected yourself, could have stepped back and let others handle the crisis. Instead, you made yourself more vulnerable by caring more deeply." Maya wasn't sure how to respond to the observation, which felt both accurate and exposing. "I realized something during this experience," Hiroko continued. "The reason our adoption program has been so successful isn't just because of our procedures or our screening processes. It's because of people like you who understand that this work is ultimately about love. Not the easy romantic kind of love, but the difficult daily choice to keep caring even when it's complicated or painful or uncertain." That afternoon, Maya received a call from Patricia Morrison, the flight attendant from Flight 447. They'd exchanged a few messages over the past 2 weeks, but this was their first real conversation since that dinner in Anchorage. "I've been following the news about the investigation. I wanted to call and tell you how proud I am of how you handled everything." "I'm not sure I handled it well," Maya admitted. I spent most of 2 weeks terrified that I'd somehow failed the children and families I was supposed to protect. But that's exactly why you handled it well, Patricia replied. You were scared because you cared so much about doing right by them. Maya, I've been thinking about our conversation that night, about my question about when someone last took care of you. I think I was wrong to frame it that way. Maya was intrigued. What do you mean?
I think the question isn't whether people take care of you. It's whether you let them, whether you trust them enough to be honest about your own needs and fears and struggles. From everything you've told me about the past 2 weeks, it sounds like you finally started letting people see who you are when you're not managing everyone else's crises. The observation hit Maya with unexpected force. She thought about her collaboration with Marcus during the investigation, about Hiroko's steady support, about the way the adoptive families had rallied around her rather than turning against her when everything seemed to be falling apart. Maybe you're right, Maya said. Maybe I have been letting people care for me, finally. It's terrifying, but also liberating, somehow. Good, Patricia said warmly. Because people who do the work you do, taking care of the most vulnerable members of our society, you need to be taken care of too. It's not selfish. It's necessary. The conversation with Patricia stayed with Maya as she prepared for her return to Los Angeles. But first, there was one more conversation she needed to have, with Detective Tanaka, who had requested a meeting to discuss the broader implications of Kenji Yamamoto's systematic fraud. They met at a coffee shop near Tokyo Metropolitan Police Headquarters, a generic space that somehow felt appropriate for discussing the bureaucratic machinations that had nearly destroyed so many dreams. Miss Chen, Detective Tanaka began. I wanted to speak with you personally because your name appeared frequently in Mr. Yamamoto's communications. He seemed particularly focused on discrediting your work. Maya felt a chill run down her spine. Why? I'd never heard of him before this investigation. That's part of what made his targeting so insidious. Mr. Yamamoto had identified several international adoption facilitators who were particularly successful, particularly trusted by both Japanese institutions and foreign families. He believed that by destroying the reputations of people like you, he could undermine confidence in the entire international adoption system. The detective pulled out a folder containing printed emails and documents. These are communications we recovered from his personal computer. Miss Chen, I think you should understand the scope of what he was planning. Maya read through the documents with growing horror. Yamamoto hadn't just fabricated complaints about Sunshine Orphanage. He'd been systematically building cases against dozens of adoption professionals across Japan, carefully timing his revelations to maximize damage and disruption. His ultimate goal, according to his own written plans, was to create enough chaos and distrust to force the Japanese government to suspend all international adoptions indefinitely. He had detailed profiles of your work, your success rates, your methods, testimonials from families you'd helped. He was using your own excellence against you, turning your track record into evidence of suspicious efficiency. Maya set down the papers, her hands shaking slightly. How many other facilitators were targeted? 47 professionals across 12 agencies. Some of them have already seen their reputations permanently damaged, their client relationships destroyed. You were fortunate that we uncovered the fraud before the allegations against you gained wider traction. The weight of what had almost happened settled over Maya like a heavy blanket. Not just her own career, but the entire network of people working to connect children with families across international borders. All of it had been under systematic attack by one person's ideological obsession. What happens to him now? Maya asked. Mr. Yamamoto will face multiple charges of fraud, defamation, and interference with child welfare proceedings. But, Ms. Chen, I want you to understand something else. His actions, while criminal, weren't entirely without foundation in legitimate concerns. Maya looked up, surprised by the detective's comment.
There are real problems with international adoption systems, not the fabricated ones Mr. Yamamoto created, but genuine issues about cultural preservation, economic disparities between countries, the complexities of cross-cultural child placement. His methods were completely wrong, but some of his underlying concerns about protecting Japanese children's connections to their heritage have validity. The observation made Maya thoughtful. She'd always been aware of the cultural dimensions of her work, had tried to ensure that children maintained connections to their birth cultures while embracing their new identities. But maybe she hadn't considered deeply enough how the entire system looked from the perspective of people who worried about cultural loss, about the implications of children being raised far from their places of birth. "What would you suggest?" Maya asked. "How could international adoption be improved to address those concerns?" Detective Tanaka smiled slightly. "That's not really my area of expertise, Ms. Chen, but I think the fact that you're asking the question suggests you're someone who might be part of the solution, rather than just defending the status quo." The flight back to Los Angeles gave Maya time to process everything she'd learned in Tokyo. The relief of seeing the adoptions finalized was enormous. Watching Kenji leave the orphanage holding his new parents' hands, his paper airplane carefully tucked in his pocket, had been one of the most emotionally satisfying moments of her career. But Detective Tanaka's comments had planted seeds of questions that she couldn't ignore. Back in her Los Angeles apartment, Maya found herself looking at her living space with new eyes. It was functional but impersonal, the home of someone who spent more time in hotel rooms and airports than in her own bedroom. The walls were decorated with photographs from successful adoptions, thank you cards from grateful families, professional certifications and awards. But there was little evidence of Maya herself, her interests, her relationships, her life outside of work. She thought about Patricia's question again, about when someone had last taken care of her, and realized that the answer was more complex than she initially understood. It wasn't that people didn't try to care for her, it's that she hadn't created space in her life to receive that care, hadn't allowed herself to be fully known by anyone. Maya opened her laptop and began typing an email to her sister, Jen, fulfilling the promise she'd made to herself in that Anchorage hotel room. "Dear Jen, I know I've been terrible about staying in touch, about sharing what's really going on in my life beyond work updates and brief check-ins. I wanted to tell you about something that happened recently that made me realize how much I've been missing by keeping everyone at arm's length." She wrote for 2 hours, telling Jen about Flight 447's emergency landing, about the investigation that had nearly destroyed her career, about the conversations with Patricia and Detective Tanaka that had made her question not just her work practices, but her entire approach to living. Most importantly, she wrote about her desire to build more genuine connections, to be more present in her relationships, to find ways to balance her professional calling with personal fulfillment. "I love the work I do. I can't imagine doing anything else with my life. But I'm realizing that in order to do it well long-term, I need to be a more complete person, someone who has sources of joy and support beyond professional success. I'd like to start with rebuilding my relationship with my sister Jen, if you're open to that." She sent the email before she could second-guess herself, then sat back and looked around her apartment again. Tomorrow, she would start making changes, small ones at first, but meaningful ones. Maybe she'd buy some plants, add some color to the sterile walls. She'd join a book club or take a cooking class. Find ways to connect with people who didn't know or care about her professional reputation. But tonight, Maya Chen, successful adoption facilitator, survivor of multiple crises, guardian of other people's dreams, was going to order takeout from that Japanese restaurant she'd been meaning to try, pour herself a glass of wine, and call Patricia Morrison just to see how her daughters were doing in school. It was a small beginning, but Maya had learned through her work with children and families that the most important transformations often started with the smallest acts of courage, the willingness to reach across whatever distance separated you from the connections you craved. As she dialed Patricia's number, Maya found herself smiling at the recognition that maybe, just maybe, she was finally ready to let herself be taken care of, one conversation at a time. 6 months later, Maya stood in the backyard of Dr. Sarah Williams' Portland home,
watching 8-year-old Hiro chase butterflies with the focused determination that had once been directed toward solving complex puzzles at Sunshine Orphanage. His clubfoot, corrected through a series of procedures that Sarah had coordinated with military precision and Jennifer had supported with endless patience, barely slowed him down now. He moved with the confident gait of a child who had never doubted his own physical capabilities. "Maya-san," Hiro called out in English that had improved dramatically over the past months. "Look what I caught." He opened his cupped hands to reveal not a butterfly, but a particularly interesting beetle that most adults would have found alarming. His mothers, however, gathered around him with genuine fascination, asking questions about the insect's markings and helping him identify its species using a field guide they kept specifically for such discoveries. This was Maya's third follow-up visit to check on the families she'd helped unite during those tumultuous weeks. It was officially part of her professional obligations. All international adoption agencies were required to conduct post-placement visits for the first 2 years. But these visits had evolved into something more personal, more meaningful than bureaucratic checkbox exercises. "She's doing incredibly well," Jennifer Williams said, joining Maya on the deck while Sarah and Hiro continued their impromptu entomology lesson. "The physical therapy is almost complete and his confidence has grown so much. But Maya, I want you to see something else." Jennifer led her into the house where the walls were covered with Hiro's artwork. Not the careful, technically precise drawings Maya remembered from the orphanage, but wild, exuberant expressions of joy and movement. Pictures of families playing together, dogs running through parks, children flying kites under enormous suns that took up half the page. "She started drawing these about 3 months ago," Jennifer explained. "Sarah asked him what changed, and he said that before he drew what he saw, now he draws what he feels." The distinction hit Maya with unexpected emotional force. She thought about Yuki's meticulously detailed birds, about how those drawings had reflected both artistic skill and a deep longing for freedom. Now, according to the last update from the Nakamuras, Yuki was creating abstract watercolors that her new art teacher described as explosions of pure happiness. Has he talked about Japan at all? About missing the orphanage or feeling disconnected from his birth culture? Sarah appeared in the doorway, having successfully convinced Hiro to release the beetle back into the garden. "Actually, that's something we've been thinking about a lot. We want to take him back to Japan next year, not just as tourists, but to reconnect with Hiroko and the other children at Sunshine. We think it's important for him to understand that becoming our son doesn't mean erasing where he came from." The comment reflected conversations Maya had been having with adoptive families more frequently since her meeting with Detective Tanaka. The investigation had revealed not just one man's criminal fraud, but genuine concerns within Japanese society about international adoption and cultural preservation. Maya had spent considerable time since then researching best practices for maintaining children's connections to their birth cultures, consulting with experts on cross-cultural identity development, and revising her own approaches to family matching. "That sounds wonderful," Maya said. "I'd be happy to help coordinate the visit when you're ready. Hiroko has mentioned several times how much she'd love to see how Hiro is doing."
The drive from Portland to Seattle took Maya through landscapes that reminded her of that strange interlude in Anchorage 6 months earlier. Mountains and forests that seemed to stretch endlessly. The kind of natural beauty that made human concerns feel both insignificant and vitally important simultaneously. She was on her way to visit the Nakamuras and Yuki, but also to attend a conference on international adoption reform that had been organized partly in response to the Tokyo investigation. The conference would bring together adoption professionals, child welfare experts, birth parents, adoptive families, and, for the first time, adult adoptees who could speak from personal experience about the long-term impacts of international placement.
Maya was scheduled to present a workshop on cultural sensitivity in adoption practice, but she was more interested in listening than speaking, in learning from perspectives she hadn't adequately considered before. The Nakamuras lived in a craftsman-style house in a quiet neighborhood where children's bicycles dotted front yards and the sound of laughter drifted from backyards. Yuki met Maya at the front door with an enthusiasm that would have been unimaginable 6 months earlier, chattering in a mixture of English and Japanese about a school art project she was excited to show off. The project turned out to be a visual autobiography, a series of paintings that told the story of her life from her earliest memories in Japan through her adoption and adjustment to life in Portland. The paintings were remarkable not just for their artistic merit, which was considerable, but for their emotional honesty. They showed sadness and confusion and fear, but also hope and joy, and the gradual emergence of a sense of belonging that felt earned rather than assumed. Yuki wanted to include this, Mrs. Nakamura said, showing Maya a painting of the airplane that had brought Yuki to America. In the picture, the plane was surrounded by swirling clouds that looked like both storms and rainbows, suggesting turbulence and beauty existing simultaneously. She said it was important to show that the journey wasn't easy, Mr. Nakamura added, but that difficult journeys can still lead to good destinations. Maya studied the painting, thinking about her own turbulent journey 6 months earlier, about how Flight 447's emergency landing had somehow prepared her for the crisis that followed, had taught her that surviving one kind of turbulence could give you strength for navigating another. "How has the language transition been?" Maya asked. This was always one of her primary concerns with international adoptions, ensuring that children maintained enough of their birth language to preserve connections to their cultural identity while acquiring enough English to succeed in their new communities. "Challenging but manageable," Mrs. Nakamura replied. "We've been attending Japanese school on Saturdays, and we've connected with a local Japanese-American community group. Yuki helps teach the other children her traditional origami techniques, and she's learning about Japanese-American history that we never covered in our own education." The comment reflected something Maya had been discovering in her post-placement visits. Successful international adoptions weren't just about placing children with families, but about creating opportunities for entire families to grow and learn together, to become more culturally competent and globally aware through the process of welcoming a child from another culture. That evening, Maya attended a dinner hosted by the conference organizers, where she found herself seated next to Dr. Keiko Tanaka, a researcher who studied long-term outcomes for international adoptees. Dr. Tanaka, no relation to the detective who had investigated the fraud case, had been adopted from Japan to the United States in the 1980s, and was now conducting groundbreaking research on cultural identity development in cross-national adoption. "I've been following your work," Dr. Tanaka said over dinner, "particularly your response to the investigation earlier this year. I was impressed by how you use that crisis as an opportunity to examine and improve your practices rather than just defending the status quo." Maya felt a familiar mix of pride and humility. "I realized that the person who was targeting our work, even though his methods were completely wrong, was raising some legitimate questions that I hadn't considered deeply enough. Questions about cultural preservation, about power dynamics between countries, about whether we were adequately preparing families for the complexities of raising children across cultural boundaries." "Those are exactly the questions that need to be at the center of international adoption practice," Dr. Tanaka agreed. "But they're also questions that don't have simple answers. My own experience being adopted internationally was overwhelmingly positive, but it took me decades to fully understand and integrate my Japanese identity with my American upbringing." The conversation continued late into the evening, covering topics that Maya had never discussed with such depth and nuance. The psychology of cultural identity formation, the importance of adoptees having access to their birth cultures throughout their development, the ways that well-meaning adoptive parents could inadvertently contribute to their children's cultural disconnection.
What advice would you give to someone like me? Maya asked as the evening wound down. Someone who wants to do this work ethically and effectively, but who is still learning about dimensions of it that I didn't even know I needed to consider. Dr. Tanaka smiled. Keep asking questions, even when they're uncomfortable. Keep listening to adoptees, even when their experiences challenge your assumptions. And remember that cultural competence isn't a destination you arrive at. It's an ongoing journey that requires humility, curiosity, and the willingness to keep growing. The next day's conference sessions covered topics ranging from trauma-informed adoption practices to the economics of international child welfare systems. Maya found herself taking notes not just on practical techniques, but on philosophical questions that were reshaping her understanding of her work. During a panel discussion on adult adoptee perspectives on international placement, she listened to stories that were both heartbreaking and inspiring. Adults who had struggled with identity issues, who had felt disconnected from both their birth and adoptive cultures, but who had also found ways to create integrated identities that honored all aspects of their backgrounds. One panelist, a woman who had been adopted from Korea in the 1990s, said something that particularly resonated with Maya. The question isn't whether international adoption is good or bad. It's whether we're doing it in ways that center the children's long-term well-being rather than the adult's immediate desires. That means being honest about the challenges, providing ongoing support, and acknowledging that love, while necessary, isn't always sufficient. After the conference, Maya drove back to Los Angeles with her head full of new ideas and her heart full of renewed commitment to continuous improvement. She'd been invited to join a working group developing new standards for international adoption practice, and she'd committed to conducting a research project examining the long-term cultural identity outcomes for children she'd helped place over the past 8 years. But first, she had one more visit to make, to 5-year-old Kenji, now 6-year-old Kenji, who was living with the Yamadas in Orange County. The Yamada house was filled with the kind of controlled chaos that indicated a child was truly at home. Kenji's artwork covered the refrigerator, his toys were scattered across the living room floor, and the sound of his laughter echoed from the backyard where he was playing with the family dog. "Maya-san," Kenji shouted when he saw her, running over with the unconscious enthusiasm of a child who had learned to trust that good things could happen and stay happen. "Look what I learned." He proceeded to demonstrate a complex origami technique that Mrs. Yamada had been teaching him, not just as a cultural connection to Japan, but as a way of developing fine motor skills and patience. "That's beautiful, Kenji," Maya said, admiring the intricately folded paper crane. "Do you remember the paper airplane you made at the orphanage?" Kenji nodded seriously. "I still have it. Do you want to see?" He led Maya to his bedroom, where the original paper airplane sat in a place of honor on his dresser, carefully preserved under a small glass dome that Mr. Yamada had created for it. Beside it was a photograph of Kenji with his birth mother from when he was a toddler, and another photo of his first day with the Yamadas. "Mama Yamada says the airplane was magic because it brought me to my family, but I think it was magic because it taught me that sometimes you have to be brave and trust that good things can happen even when you're scared." The observation, delivered with the matter-of-fact wisdom that children sometimes possessed, made Maya's throat tight with emotion. She thought about her own paper airplane moment, that terrifying experience on Flight 447 that had somehow prepared her for everything that followed, that had taught her that turbulence could be survived, and that courage could be found in the most unexpected circumstances. "You're very wise, Kenji," she said. "And you're right about being brave. Sometimes the best things in life require us to be brave first." As Maya prepared to leave the Yamada house, Mrs. Yamada pulled her aside for a private conversation. "Maya-san, I wanted to thank you for something beyond the obvious," she said. "When the investigation happened, when everything seemed uncertain, you could have walked away. You could have protected yourself and let us figure things out on our own. Instead, you fought for us, for all of the families. You showed us what it means to keep promises, even when it's difficult. Maya felt tears prick at her eyes. You were trusting me with the most important thing in your lives. How could I do anything less than everything possible to honor that trust? That's exactly why Kenji was so lucky to have you as his advocate, and why all of us were so fortunate to have someone who understood that this work isn't just about paperwork and procedures. It's about love and commitment and the belief that families can be created through intention and effort, not just biology. Driving back to her apartment that evening, Maya reflected on how much had changed in the 6 months since that terrifying flight and the investigation that followed. The external changes were significant. She joined the working group on adoption reform, had begun collaborating with researchers on long-term outcome studies, had started speaking at conferences about cultural competency and international placement. But the internal changes felt even more profound. She'd learned to ask for help when she needed it, to acknowledge uncertainty without losing confidence, to balance professional dedication with personal fulfillment. She'd started dating someone, a teacher named David, who worked with immigrant children and who understood the demands and rewards of work that centered on other people's well-being. She'd renovated her apartment, adding color and warmth and personal touches that made it feel like a home rather than just a place to sleep between trips. Most importantly, Maya had learned to see her work not as a series of problems to be solved, but as an ongoing relationship with children and families whose lives intersected with hers in profound and lasting ways. The follow-up visits weren't just professional obligations. They were opportunities to witness the long-term impacts of decisions made during brief, intense periods of matching and placement. Kenji's preserved paper airplane had become a symbol for Maya of something she was still learning to articulate. The idea that courage and hope, once activated, could continue to generate positive outcomes long after the initial act of bravery had passed. Every child she helped place, every family she brought together, created ripple effects that extended far beyond her ability to track or measure. That night, Maya sat at her kitchen table writing in the journal she'd been keeping since her return from Tokyo. She wrote about her visits with Hiro and Yuki and Kenji, about the conference presentations that had challenged her assumptions, about the ways her understanding of her work continued to evolve and deepen. 6 months ago, she wrote, I thought my job was to help children find families. I'm beginning to understand that what I actually do is help create new forms of love that didn't exist before. Connections that cross cultures and continent and all the barriers that usually separate people from each other. It's more complex and more beautiful than I ever imagined, and it requires me to keep growing and learning and questioning my own assumptions in ways that are sometimes uncomfortable, but always necessary.
She paused in her writing to look out the window at the Los Angeles skyline, thinking about all the journeys, literal and metaphorical, that had brought her to this moment of understanding. Tomorrow, she would begin preparations for her next trip to Tokyo, where 3 new children were waiting for families and where she would continue the work that had become not just her profession, but her calling. Maya smiled as she returned to her journal, writing one final observation before closing the notebook and preparing for sleep. Sometimes the most important destinations are the ones we never planned to reach, and sometimes the most meaningful journeys begin with turbulence that forces us to find reserves of strength we didn't know we possessed. 3 years later, Maya stood in the departure lounge at LAX, watching Flight 447 to Tokyo board passengers. She wasn't flying today. Her travel had become less frequent as her role had evolved from field facilitator to program director and researcher. But she made a point of coming to the airport occasionally to watch this particular flight depart, a ritual that had become both memorial and celebration of how profoundly one terrifying afternoon had changed the trajectory of her life. Seat 23C was occupied today by a businessman who looked harried and impatient, probably more concerned with Wi-Fi connectivity than life-changing revelations.
Maya smiled at the irony, remembering her own obliviousness to the transformation that had awaited her in that same seat 3 years earlier. Her phone buzzed with a text from Patricia Morrison, who had become not just a friend, but a close confidant and informal mentor in the years since their emergency landing in Anchorage. Patricia was now based in Seattle, flying domestic routes that allowed her more time with her daughters, both of whom were thriving. The older one had indeed pursued social work and was currently completing her master's degree, while the younger had been accepted into a prestigious aviation program and was well on her way to becoming a pilot. "Thinking of you today," Patricia's text read. "3 years ago, you were scared on an airplane. Now you're changing how international adoption works. Pretty amazing transformation." Maya typed back, "Pretty amazing friendship that started with oxygen masks and bureaucratic nightmares. Dinner next week when you're in LA?" The response came immediately. "Wouldn't miss it. I want to hear about the new protocols you're implementing." The new protocols represented 2 years of intensive research and collaboration with adoption professionals, child welfare experts, and, crucially, adult adoptees from around the world. Maya's experience during the investigation had led her to recognize that the field of international adoption needed significant reform, not because the existing system was fundamentally flawed, but because it could be significantly improved through better understanding of long-term outcomes and cultural preservation needs. Maya's organization had become a model for other agencies, implementing what they called lifelong adoption support that included pre-placement cultural education for adoptive families, ongoing resources for maintaining birth culture connections, and regular check-ins that extended well beyond the traditional 2-year requirement. Most innovatively, they had established mentorship programs connecting adult adoptees with newly adoptive families, providing practical guidance on navigating cross-cultural identity development. "Miss Chen?" A voice interrupted her airport reverie. Maya turned to see a young woman, maybe 19 or 20, with features that suggested mixed heritage and eyes that seemed somehow familiar. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I recognized you from the photos in my adoption file. I'm Emma Rodriguez. You helped place me with my family when I was 4 years old." Maya's heart stopped. Emma, the little girl with curly red hair and enormous green eyes who had been so frightened during Flight 447's emergency. The child Maya had comforted by talking about ramen and patient chefs and dreams worth waiting for.
"Emma," Maya breathed. "Oh my goodness, look at you! You're so grown up! What are you doing here?" Emma smiled with the confident warmth of someone who had grown up secure in her family's love. "I'm flying to Tokyo, actually, to study abroad for a semester. I'm majoring in international relations with a focus on cross-cultural child welfare policy. I wanted to see where I came from, to understand more about the system that brought me to my parents." The revelation hit Maya with overwhelming emotion. This young woman, whose terror during a flight emergency had helped Maya find her own courage, was now pursuing a field that would allow her to impact international adoption from a policy perspective. "Your parents must be so proud," Maya said. "They are, but they're also nervous about me traveling so far from home," Emma laughed. "Mom still worries about me on airplanes, even though I keep telling her that statistically, flying is the safest form of travel." "Actually," Maya said, thinking about her own relationship with aviation anxiety, "I think your mom's concern has less to do with statistics and more to do with the fact that airplanes represent big changes, important journeys, transformative moments that can reshape entire lives." Emma considered this seriously. "That makes sense. The airplane that brought me to America when I was 4 changed everything about my life. And now this airplane is taking me back to learn about where I started. Maybe airplanes are kind of magical in that way." The comment sent chills down Maya's spine as she remembered 5-year-old Kenji's similar observation about the magic of airplanes. She thought about all the flights she'd taken over the years, all the journeys that had carried children toward their new families and brought families together across impossible distances. "Emma, can I ask you something personal?" Maya said. "How do you feel about having been adopted internationally? Do you ever wish things had been different?" The question was one Maya had learned to ask adult adoptees as part of her research, though it always felt invasive and potentially painful. But Emma's response was immediate and thoughtful. "I feel grateful, but also complicated," she said. "I love my family, I love my life, I love the opportunities I've had growing up in America, but I also sometimes wonder about the life I might have had if I'd stayed in Japan, about the culture and language I lost, about the birth family I never knew. I think both things can be true, that adoption saved my life and gave me amazing opportunities, and that it also involved losses that I'm still processing." The honesty and nuance of Emma's response reflected everything Maya had learned through her research and reform work. International adoption wasn't a simple rescue narrative or an unqualified good. It was a complex intervention that involved both tremendous benefits and genuine losses, both successful outcomes and ongoing challenges. That's exactly the kind of perspective that needs to inform how we approach this work, Maya said. Have you ever considered getting involved in adoption reform or policy work? Emma's eyes lit up. Actually, that's part of why I'm going to Tokyo. I want to understand the Japanese perspective on international adoption, to research the cultural and policy factors that lead to children being placed internationally rather than domestically. I'm thinking about writing my senior thesis on comparative international adoption policies. Maya felt a surge of excitement. "Emma, I'd love to stay in touch with you about your research. The organization I work with is always looking for opportunities to collaborate with scholars who understand adoption from personal experience as well as academic perspectives." They exchanged contact information, and Maya watched as Emma walked toward her gate with the confident stride of someone who had grown up knowing she was wanted and loved. As Emma disappeared into the boarding tunnel, Maya felt a profound sense of completion, as if some circle that had begun 3 years ago was finally closing. Her phone rang. David, her boyfriend of 2 years, calling from the elementary school where he taught.
"How's the airport pilgrimage going?" he asked, with the gentle teasing that had become part of their relationship. David understood Maya's need to occasionally revisit significant locations, to mark anniversaries of transformation with small rituals of remembrance and gratitude. "Actually, it was more meaningful than usual," Maya said, telling him about her encounter with Emma. "I keep being amazed by how these connections persist across years, how one brief interaction can ripple outward in ways you never anticipate." "That's what I love about your work," David said. "And about you. You plant seeds everywhere you go, and then you get to watch them grow into things you never could have imagined." The observation made Maya think about all the seeds that had been planted during that turbulent period 3 years earlier. Flight 447's emergency landing had taught her about her own resilience and capacity for courage. The investigation that followed had forced her to examine and improve her professional practices. The relationships she built with Patricia, with Detective Tanaka, with Dr. Keiko Tanaka, and other researchers had expanded her understanding of her work's complexities and possibilities. But perhaps most importantly, those experiences had taught Maya how to balance professional dedication with personal fulfillment, how to maintain the deep commitment her work required while also creating space for her own growth and happiness. "I'll be home in an hour," Maya told David. "Want to cook dinner together? I have stories to tell you about the amazing young woman I just met." "I'd love that. I'll stop by the market and get ingredients for that Japanese-inspired dish you've been wanting to try." Maya smiled as she ended the call, thinking about how food had become one of the ways she and David connected with the cultures represented in their work. He had learned to cook dishes from the home countries of his ESL students, while Maya had mastered recipes from Japan, Korea, and other nations that were part of her adoption practice. Their kitchen had become a kind of cultural laboratory where they explored flavors and techniques that connected them to the children and families they served. Walking back through the airport terminal, Maya passed the gate where Flight 447 was now boarding.
She paused to watch passengers settling into their seats, stowing carry-on luggage, preparing for the long journey across the Pacific. Some looked nervous, gripping armrests and checking seatbelt fastenings. Others appeared relaxed, already absorbed in books or tablets. A few gazed out the windows with expressions of anticipation, clearly excited about whatever awaited them in Tokyo. Maya wondered which of these travelers might experience their own transformative turbulence, which might find themselves tested and changed by circumstances they couldn't predict or control. She said a small prayer for their safety and for their openness to whatever lessons their journey might offer. 5 years later, the conference room at UCLA was packed beyond capacity, with additional attendees watching via video link from locations around the world. Maya stood at the podium, looking out at an audience that included adoption professionals, child welfare experts, policymakers, and most importantly, adult adoptees whose experiences had informed the research she was about to present. Ladies and gentlemen, 5 years ago, I thought I understood my work. I believed that successful international adoption meant finding good families for vulnerable children, facilitating placements that met legal requirements and satisfied everyone involved. What I've learned since then is that truly ethical international adoption requires us to think in terms of decades rather than years, to consider cultural preservation alongside family formation, and to center the voices of adoptees themselves in every aspect of our practice. The presentation that followed summarized 5 years of intensive research into long-term outcomes for internationally adopted children, examining not just traditional measures of success like educational achievement and family stability, but deeper questions about cultural identity, psychological well-being, and the complex negotiations involved in forming integrated identities across cultures. The findings were encouraging and sobering. Children who maintained connections to their birth cultures throughout their development showed better long-term psychological outcomes than those who were completely assimilated into their adoptive families' cultures. Families who received ongoing support and education about cross-cultural parenting were more successful at navigating the inevitable challenges that arose as children developed their own relationships with their dual identities. Most significantly, Maya's research had identified specific practices that could dramatically improve outcomes: regular cultural education for adoptive families, mentorship programs connecting adult adoptees with newly formed families, and institutional support for return visits to birth countries during adolescence.
The question, Maya continued, is not whether international adoption should continue. There will always be children who need families, and families who can provide loving homes across national boundaries. The question is whether we can implement these practices in ways that honor the full complexity of what we're asking children and families to navigate. During the question and answer session that followed, Maya was asked about the personal experiences that had informed her research. She told the audience about Flight 447, about meeting Emma during a moment of crisis and encountering her again years later as a young adult pursuing policy work that would impact future generations of adoptees. What that experience taught me, Maya said, is that every interaction in this field has potential long-term consequences we can't predict. Every child we help place, every family we bring together, every policy we advocate for or against, all of it ripples outward in ways that extend far beyond our 10 years later, Maya stood at the podium of the International Adoption Reform Summit in Geneva, looking out at delegates from 43 countries. Behind her, a presentation slide showed a photograph of 13 young adults, Kenji, Yuki, Hiro, and 10 others, all thriving in their adoptive families while maintaining connections to their birth cultures. Ladies and gentlemen,
Maya began. "A decade ago, I thought I knew what success looked like in international adoption. I measured it in placements completed, families satisfied, paperwork properly filed. But I learned something during a terrifying flight and the crisis that followed. True success isn't measured in transactions, it's measured in transformations." She clicked to the next slide. Emma Rodriguez, now Dr. Emma Rodriguez, leading a research team at the Tokyo Institute for Child Welfare. "The children we help place don't just join families, they become bridges between cultures, advocates for other vulnerable children, forces for positive change in the world. Our job isn't to move children from one country to another, it's to create the conditions for love to flourish across every boundary that typically divides us." As applause filled the auditorium, Maya thought about that paper airplane Kenji had carried years ago. About his question whether airplanes were magic. She'd learned they weren't magic. They were something better. They were proof that courage, hope, and commitment could carry people across any distance to find each other. Her phone buzzed with a text from Patricia Morrison. "Watching your speech online. Remember when we thought the scariest thing was hydraulic failure? Now look at you, changing the world one family at a time." Maya smiled, knowing that sometimes the most important journeys began with turbulence that taught you to find reserves of strength you never knew you possessed. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, those journeys never really ended. They just kept expanding into new horizons of possibility.